America's first colony was so much worse than you think. In 1607, 3 small ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, pushed across 4,000 miles of hostile ocean. After 5 brutal months at sea, they spotted land, the mouth of a great river on the coast of Virginia. They named it the James, after their king. They built a fort. They called it Jamestown. And then, according to the version most of us learned, they struggled. There was hunger. There was hardship. There were some conflicts with the local Indians. But eventually, a man named John Smith took charge. A young woman named Pocahontas saved his life, and the colony hung on by its fingernails until tobacco made everyone rich. Pilgrims get the turkey and the buckles. Jamestown gets the gritty origin story, tough but triumphant. The beginning of America. That version is a lie. Not just a little lie, not just a simplification for textbooks, a catastrophic, almost willful lie that has been polished and repackaged for 400 years. Because the truth about America's first permanent English colony is so much worse than anything you've ever heard. It's a story of such profound horror, such systematic cruelty, such desperate stupidity, that your brain will try to reject it. This isn't The New World with Colin Farrell. This isn't a Disney movie with a singing grandmother willow. This is a nightmare dressed in Elizabethan doublets and hose. We're talking about cannibalism, not as a last resort after a blizzard. We're talking about a woman and a child butchered for stew meat while other colonists watched and waited for their turn. We're talking about a man who murdered his pregnant wife and then, well, you'll see. We're talking about a colony that collapsed into such profound moral and physical decay that when resupply ships finally arrived, they found the survivors eating the dead from their graves. And we're talking about a legal system so brutal that a man was burned at the stake for the crime of speaking Spanish. The real story of Jamestown doesn't end with John Rolfe's tobacco crop. It ends with a question. What kind of people do we become when we are hungry, scared, and completely unmoored from everything we thought we knew about civilization? The answer, as it turns out, is something far worse than savages. So let's throw out the textbook. Let's forget everything you think you know about Powhatan, Pocahontas, and John Smith. Let's sail back to 1607. But this time we're not looking for the birthplace of America, we're looking for the first circle of hell. And we're going to find it, the wrong people in the wrong place. Before we even get to the blood and the bone soup, we have to understand one thing. Jamestown was doomed from the drawing board. Not because of bad luck, not because of the weather, because the people who planned it were wealthy idiots who had never grown a potato or chopped down a tree. And the people who sailed there were gentlemen who had never done a day's work with their hands. The Virginia Company of London was a joint stock company. Think of it as a 17th century startup. Investors put up money. They expected a return. And the sales pitch they'd been given was absolutely insane. The promoters claimed that Virginia was a temperate paradise like southern France. They said the rivers were lined with gold and precious gems. They said the native people were gentle and eager to trade. They said the soil was so rich that crops would practically grow themselves. None of that was true. But the 104 men and boys who climbed aboard those 3 ships in December 1606 believed it. Or at least they wanted to believe it, because most of them had nothing to lose. They were the second sons of minor gentry, men who would inherit no land, no title, no future in England. They were younger brothers, disgraced soldiers, bankrupt artisans, and a sprinkling of outright criminals. They were, in the blunt assessment of one historian, the dregs of English society, and they were spectacularly unequipped for what awaited them. Let me give you a list of the skills that would have been useful in early Jamestown: farming, fishing, hunting, carpentry, blacksmithing, masonry, medicine, wilderness survival. Now let me give you a list of the skills the colonists actually possessed: courtly dancing, poetry writing, heraldry, dueling, lute playing, and the ability to argue about theology for 6 hours without repeating themselves. More than half the men were gentlemen. That meant they considered physical labor beneath them. They had servants to do that. Except the servants were also mostly unskilled because the servants had been plucked from the streets of London. Tailors, haberdashers, a perfumer, a man whose only documented skill was playing the trumpet. One colonist, a gentleman named George Percy, later wrote a detailed account of their first winter. He mentioned the hunger, the cold, the death. He did not mention ever holding a shovel. The Virginia Company had also made a catastrophic strategic error. They weren't sending settlers. They were sending a military garrison. The original plan was not to build a self-sustaining colony. It was to build a fortified outpost from which to raid Spanish shipping, search for gold, and perhaps capture a few Native Americans to sell as slaves in Europe. The men were armed to the teeth. They had cannons, muskets, suits of armor. What they did not have was a single plow, enough seed corn to last a season, or any real understanding of how to feed themselves. So they arrived, and they picked the worst possible spot on the entire James River, the Island of Death. Why did they build Jamestown where they did? The short answer, paranoia. The long answer, spectacularly misinformed paranoia. The site they chose was a swampy peninsula about 60 miles from the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. It was surrounded on 3 sides by water. It was, in military terms, defensible. A small force could hold off a much larger attack. The ships could anchor right offshore. The cannons could command the river. But here's what they didn't realize, because they arrived in May, when Virginia is actually beautiful. That swampy peninsula was tidal. Twice a day, the James River rose and flooded the ground with brackish water. Twice a day, it receded, leaving behind stagnant pools. The drinking water was not fresh. It was a brown, salty, sludgy cocktail of river silt, human waste, and the decomposition of millions of insects and plants. Every sip introduced bacteria into their guts. Every glass was a mild poison. And the mosquitoes. God, the mosquitoes. Virginia in the summer is a wet, hot, buzzing hellscape. The colonists had no understanding of mosquito-borne disease. They thought malaria was caused by bad air, miasma rising from swamps. They weren't wrong about the swamps. They were wrong about the mechanism. The air was bad, yes. But the real killers were the clouds of insects that bred in the stagnant pools and bit every inch of exposed skin. Within 2 weeks of arrival, the men began to sicken. A fever that came in waves, shaking chills, then burning heat, then drenching sweats. Their livers swelled, their spleens swelled, their eyes turned yellow. They became so weak that they could not stand. This was malaria, mixed with typhoid and dysentery from the polluted water, and possibly yellow fever carried by the same mosquitoes. The colonists had no name for it. They just called it the sickness. And it never stopped. For years. We have the numbers. They are almost incomprehensible. Of the 104 original settlers, 38 were dead by September 16, 07, just 4 months after landing. By January 1608, only 38 remained alive. Think about that. 66% mortality in the first 8 months, and this was the good year. The 1609 to 1610 winter, the famous starving time, would kill 80% of the colony. But even before that, Jamestown was a charnel house. Men died in their beds, on the latrine, while standing guard. They died alone in the woods after wandering off in fever dreams. They died on the ships anchored in the river, where the bilge water was as foul as anything on land. The gentleman George Percy, who would briefly serve as governor, kept a journal. His prose is stiff, formal, Elizabethan. But when he describes the sickness, something breaks through. He writes of men driven through insufferable hunger to eat things not fit for men. He writes of corpses lying unburied because there was no one left alive to dig the graves. He writes of a man whose tongue swelled so big that it filled his mouth, and he died in great misery. By the time the first resupply ship arrived in January 1608, 8 months after the colony was founded, the captain found the fort in ruins, the palisades rotting, and the survivors huddled in huts that smelled like open graves. They had eaten all the dogs, all the cats, all the rats, all the mice. They had eaten their boots. They had eaten the leather from their saddles. And they had only just begun. The Great Lie of John Smith. Now we have to talk about John Smith, because if you learned about Jamestown in school, you learned that John Smith was the hero who saved the colony. He imposed discipline. He said, "He who shall not work shall not eat." He negotiated with Powhatan. He was saved from execution by Pocahontas. He was the strong hand that kept everything from falling apart. Almost none of that is true. John Smith was a mercenary. Before he ever set foot in Virginia, he had fought in wars across Europe. He had been enslaved by the Ottomans. He had escaped by killing his master and fleeing across Russia. He was, by any measure, a tough, clever, and thoroughly unpleasant man. He was also a compulsive liar. Smith's famous "he who shall not work shall not eat" policy did happen, sort of. In the winter of 1608, after the first wave of death, Smith did take command. He did force the gentlemen to fish, to chop wood, to build shelters. He did trade with the local Powhatan Indians for corn. These were good things. Without Smith, the colony almost certainly would have collapsed completely in 1608. But Smith's own account of his adventures, the one he published back in England to make himself famous, is wildly embellished. The story of Pocahontas saving his life? Smith didn't even mention it in his first report. He added it years later, after Pocahontas had become famous in London, and the way he tells it changes every time. Sometimes she throws herself on him to stop the execution. Sometimes she clutches his head in her arms. Sometimes she's a child of 10 or 11. Sometimes she's a young woman. Historians now believe that what actually happened was a Powhatan adoption ritual. Smith was never going to be executed. The whole thing was a ceremony designed to incorporate him into the chiefdom as a subordinate leader. Pocahontas, whose real name was Matawaka, was probably just a participant in the ritual. But Smith needed a dramatic rescue, and he needed a grateful Indian princess to make England fall in love with the idea of empire. The real damage Smith did is less famous. He was brutal. He didn't negotiate with Powhatan so much as threaten him. On one trading mission, Smith put his pistol to the chest of an old Indian man and demanded corn. When the man hesitated, Smith had him dragged to the boat and held hostage until the village paid up. This was standard operating procedure for Smith. He believed that the only thing Indians understood was force. And he was right, in the sense that his brutality created exactly the kind of enemies he claimed to be preventing. By the time Smith left Virginia in 1609, after a gunpowder burn forced him to return to England for treatment, he had done something remarkable. He had kept the colony alive for 2 years, but he had also taught the Powhatan Confederacy that the English were violent, untrustworthy, and dangerous. And he had left behind a colony that had no idea how to survive without him. When he sailed away, the real nightmare began. The starving time is September 1609. 500 new settlers arrive. 500. The Virginia Company, desperate to turn a profit, has thrown everything at Jamestown. Ships packed with men, women, and children. They bring supplies, they bring livestock, they bring hope. Within 2 weeks, a hurricane scatters the fleet. The flagship, the Sea Venture, is wrecked on Bermuda, an event that will later inspire Shakespeare's The Tempest. Most of the supplies are lost. The livestock drowns. The remaining ships straggle into Jamestown one by one, battered and half empty. The colony now has roughly 300 people. It has food for maybe 10 days. What follows is the single most horrifying episode in early American history. Historians call it the starving time. That name is too gentle. It sounds like a diet. It sounds like a rough patch. What happened in Jamestown between September 1609 and May 1610 was an apocalypse. The Powhatan, led by Chief Powhatan, whose real name was Wahun Seneca, had had enough. For 2 years, the English had been taking corn, kidnapping people, burning villages. Now Powhatan ordered a total blockade, no trade, no food. Anyone caught bringing corn to the English would be executed. His warriors surrounded the Jamestown Peninsula. They killed any colonist who ventured outside the palisade. They waited. Inside the fort, the hunger began. First went the horses, then the dogs, then the cats, then the rats, then the mice, then the snakes. Then the leather from the saddles, then the leather from the armor straps, then the starch from the collars, then the glue from the bindings of books. People began to eat things that were never food. George Percy, in his account, writes of a man who cut his wife's body in pieces and salted it for food. Not a stranger, not an enemy, his wife. He butchered her like a hog and packed her in salt. When the governor, a man named Sir Thomas Gates, finally arrived from Bermuda in May 1610, he found a nightmare. The palisades had been torn down for firewood. The huts had collapsed. The fields were empty. And of the 300 people who had been there in September, only 60 remained alive. Gates's men found the evidence. A corpse in a cellar with its cheeks cut out. A young man digging up a grave in the churchyard. A woman's dismembered remains in a cooking pot. A child's skull cracked open for the marrow. The survivors were not heroic. They were not noble. They were hollow-eyed, trembling, barely human. They had eaten their shoes, their belts, their dead. Some of them had eaten the dead before they were quite dead, and they had done it all while the Powhatan watched from across the river, waiting for the last Englishman to die so they could reclaim their land. Here is the detail that never makes it into the history books. The colonists didn't just eat the dead in secret. Some of them began to crave it. One man, a gentleman named Hugh Price, was executed for murdering his pregnant wife, not in a fit of rage, but methodically, so he could eat her. He was caught because he was seen licking his fingers after the act. Another group of men dug up a recently buried corpse, removed the flesh, and then complained that it was not salty enough. We have letters, we have depositions. We have the testimony of survivors who were so traumatized that they could barely speak of what they had seen. The starving time was not a natural disaster. It was not bad luck. It was the logical conclusion of sending incompetent, arrogant men into a landscape they did not understand, with enemies they had created through their own cruelty without the basic skills to feed themselves. And the worst part? When rescue finally arrived, the survivors didn't want to stay. They wanted to burn the fort to the ground and sail back to England. They would have done it too if another fleet hadn't arrived at the last moment with fresh supplies and a new governor named Thomas West, Lord de la Warr. Lord de la Warr's first act was to impose martial law. His second act was to hang a man for stealing a loaf of bread. His third act was to lead a brutal campaign against the Powhatan, burning villages and cutting down cornfields. Civilization had returned to Jamestown. And it was worse than the starvation, the law of the gallows. When Lord de la Warr arrived, he brought more than food and soldiers. He brought a legal code known as the Laws Divine, Morale, and Martial. It was, to put it mildly, insane. The code listed more than 40 capital crimes. 40. You could be executed for blasphemy, for treason, for mutiny, for desertion, for murder, obviously, but also for stealing a handkerchief, for stealing a chicken, for speaking disrespectfully of the king, for criticizing the governor, for attempting to run away to the Indians, for trading with the Indians without permission, for selling weapons to the Indians, for being found with the Indians, for visiting the Indians, for thinking about the Indians in a way the governor didn't like. You could be executed for wasting gunpowder, for leaving your sentry post, for falling asleep on guard duty, for failing to attend church twice a day, for failing to say your prayers loud enough, for detraction, slander, and calumny against any official. You could be executed for not working hard enough, for pretending to be sick when you weren't, for being sick when they thought you were pretending, for hiding food, for eating more than your ration, for looking like you might be hiding food. The punishments were not just death. They were designed to be as painful in public as possible. One man was tied to a tree and left to starve to death over 2 weeks, so that the other colonists could watch and remember. Another was broken on the wheel, his bones shattered one by one with an iron bar. Another was burned at the stake. For what? For claiming that he was not subject to English law because he was a Spanish subject. The crime was speaking Spanish in a colony where Spanish was the language of the enemy. The punishment was fire. The most famous case is that of a man named John Dodds. Dodds was a blacksmith, one of the few genuinely useful people in the colony. He had a disagreement with the governor. Words were exchanged. Dodds, a hot-tempered man, said something about the governor that was unflattering. He was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death. The only reason he survived is that the governor needed someone to repair the fort's ironwork. Dodds was granted a temporary reprieve. He spent the rest of his life looking over his shoulder. But the most revealing case is that of a boy. A teenager, really, a servant named Thomas. Thomas stole a small amount of oatmeal from the communal stores, not because he was greedy, but because he was hungry. He was caught, tried, and sentenced to be hanged. The other colonists pleaded for his life. The governor refused. The boy was hanged from a makeshift gallows while the other servants watched, weeping. The message was clear. There is no mercy here. There is no forgiveness. There is only the law, and the law is a machine for turning men into corpses. What is fascinating and horrifying about the laws is how they revealed the psychology of the colony's leaders. They were terrified. Not of the Indians, though that was real. They were terrified of their own men. They knew that the colonists were hungry, desperate, and angry. They knew that a mutiny could end the colony in a single night. So they created a system of terror so complete, so all-encompassing, that no one dared to breathe without permission. The colony was not a community. It was a prison, and the prisoners were eating each other. The real Pocahontas, we have to talk about her, because the Pocahontas we think we know, the romantic heroine, the ecstatic bridge between two worlds, the woman who chose love over duty, is a fiction. The real Pocahontas lived a life of such profound tragedy that it makes the Disney version look like a crime against history. She was born around 1596. Her father, Wahun Seneca, whom the English called Powhatan, was the leader of a powerful confederacy of about 30 Algonquian-speaking tribes. She was not a princess in the European sense. Her father had many children and many wives, and his succession was not automatic. But she was important. She was beloved. And she was curious. When the English arrived in 1607, she was about 11 years old. She visited the fort frequently. She liked the English, or at least found them interesting. She would turn cartwheels through the settlement, the accounts tell us, naked as a child, laughing, startling the uptight English gentleman who had never seen a little girl behave that way. She brought them food. She warned them of attacks. She was, in the words of one colonist, the instrument to preserve this colony from death, famine, and utter confusion. But here's what you don't know. In 1613, seen during a period of renewed warfare between the English and the Powhatan, Captain Samuel Argall kidnapped Pocahontas. He lured her onto a ship with the promise of a copper kettle, then locked her in a cabin. She was 17 years old. The English held her hostage for more than a year. They demanded that her father release English prisoners, return stolen weapons, and pay a ransom of corn. Powhatan returned the prisoners and some of the weapons. He paid some corn, but he refused to pay the full ransom, and so his daughter remained a prisoner. While she was held at Jamestown, a widowed tobacco planter named John Rolfe began to visit her. He was a pious, serious man. She was a young woman in captivity. What happened next is unclear. Rolfe wrote a long, tortured letter to the governor explaining that he loved Pocahontas and wished to marry her, but that his love was a spiritual thing. He swore, a desire to save her soul, not a carnal lust. The letter is so full of self-flagellation and theological hand-wringing that it's hard to know what he actually felt. She converted to Christianity. She was baptized with the name Rebecca. And in April 1614, she married John Rolfe. The wedding was a political event designed to end the war. It worked, more or less. There would be peace between the English and the Powhatan for 8 years. In 1616, the Virginia Company brought Pocahontas to England. She was a propaganda tool, living proof that the English could civilize the savages. That colonization was a holy mission, that the Indians were grateful. She was paraded through London. She attended a masque at the palace. She was presented to King James I. And she was miserable. She had been taken from her home, her family, her people. She had been converted to a religion she barely understood. She had married a man she may or may not have loved. And now she was being displayed like a trophy in a country where everyone stared at her and talked about her as if she weren't there. In March 1617, as the Rolfes prepared to sail back to Virginia, Pocahontas fell ill. She had never been exposed to European diseases. Her body had no immunity to the common colds and flus that circulated through the crowded, filthy streets of London. She died on a ship moored in the Thames River. She was about 21 years old. John Rolfe buried her in Gravesend, England. He returned to Virginia alone. He never spoke of her again, at least not in any document that survives. The romantic story of Pocahontas, the girl who saved John Smith, who fell in love with John Rolfe, who chose the English way of life, is a story the English told themselves to feel better about kidnapping a child and destroying her world. The real story is shorter, sadder, and much more common. A young woman caught between two cultures, used as a pawn by both, dead before her 22nd birthday. The cannibalism you haven't heard about. I mentioned cannibalism earlier. I want to come back to it because the starving time was not an isolated incident. And the cannibalism that happened was not the clean, desperate, last resort cannibalism you read about in survival stories. It was something darker, something systematic, something that suggests the colonists were not just hungry, they were broken. In 2012, archaeologists working at Jamestown made a discovery that made headlines around the world. They found the remains of a 14-year-old girl buried in a trash pit inside the fort. Her skull and shin bone showed clear evidence of butchery, the same cut marks a hunter would make to remove meat from a deer. The marks were precise, methodical. Someone had known exactly what they were doing. The archaeologists named her Jane. They could not identify her from historical records. She was one of hundreds of forgotten dead. But her bones told a story that the written accounts had hinted at but never fully confessed. The cuts on Jane's skull were made by someone trying to remove the brain. The brain is rich in fats and nutrients. In a starvation situation, it is valuable. But the cuts were too neat, too careful. This was not the frantic hacking of a starving man driven mad by hunger. This was cold, deliberate, almost clinical. Someone had taken the time to do it right. The shin bone showed the same pattern. The meat had been stripped off in long, clean strips. The marrow had been extracted. The bone had been broken open in a way that suggests the use of a heavy tool, like a cleaver or a hatchet. Who was Jane? She might have been a servant. She might have been a gentleman's daughter. We don't know, but we know that she was butchered by someone who had done it before, or who had at least thought about it carefully. And we know that her body was thrown in a trash pit, not buried in the churchyard. She was not mourned. She was disposed of. The Jane discovery confirmed what historians had long suspected. The cannibalism at Jamestown was not a one-time aberration. It was a survival strategy, and it was not limited to the starving time. Evidence suggests that colonists ate human flesh in other desperate moments during the winter of 1608, for example, and again in 1612 after another failed harvest. We know the names of some of the victims. A woman named Mrs. Forrest, a boy named Thomas, a man named Richard Mutton. And yes, historians have noted the grim irony. We know the names of some of the perpetrators too, though the records are spotty. Most were never punished. The leaders of the colony, including Governor Gates and Lord de la Warr, knew what was happening. They looked the other way. They were eating the dead themselves. There is a moment in George Percy's account that has haunted me since I first read it. He is describing the condition of the survivors when the rescue ships finally arrived. He writes, "Some of the survivors had been forced to eat the corpses of their own countrymen. Others had eaten the corpses of their own wives and children, and still others had done worse. Though of these I will not speak, for the telling would shame us all." What was worse than eating your own wife? Percy does not say, but the implication hangs in the air like smoke. There were things done in that fort that the survivors could not bring themselves to write down. Acts that shamed them 400 years later across the divide of centuries. The Great Slaughter of 1622. You might think the horrors of Jamestown ended with the starving time. You would be wrong. The colony survived, barely, lurching from crisis to crisis. Tobacco made a few men rich. More settlers arrived. The population grew. But the peace with the Powhatan, the peace that had been bought with Pocahontas's marriage, was a lie. And in 1622, the lie exploded. Opechancanough was the brother of Chief Powhatan. When Powhatan died in 1618, Opechancanough took control of the Confederacy. He had watched the English for 15 years. He had seen them multiply. He had seen them clear forests, plant fields, build houses. He had seen them bring more and more settlers, spreading like a rash across the land. And he had decided that they had to die. On the morning of March 22nd, 1622, the Powhatan launched a coordinated attack. They struck not just at Jamestown, but at every English settlement along the James River. In the span of a few hours, they killed 347 Englishmen, women, and children, about a third of the colony's total population. The attack was devastating, not just because of the numbers, but because of the way it was done. The Powhatan had lived alongside the English for years. They came to the settlements every day to trade, to talk, to work. They ate breakfast with the colonists, they borrowed tools, they knew everyone's name. And on the morning of the attack, they walked into the settlements as they always did, carrying food, carrying furs, carrying their usual friendly smiles. Then they picked up whatever was at hand. Hoes, axes, knives, musket stocks. They beat the English to death in their fields, in their homes, in their beds. They killed children in front of their parents, parents in front of their children. They killed so fast and so quietly that the settlements downriver had no idea anything was wrong until the bodies floated past. The survivors were the ones who happened to be in the most fortified positions, or who received warning at the last moment. A young boy named Richard Pace rode all night up the James to warn Jamestown. His warning saved the capital. But everywhere else, the killing continued, until the Powhatan ran out of targets or grew tired. When it was over, the English did what the English always did. They retaliated out of all proportion to the attack. They declared a war of extermination. They attacked every Indian village they could find, burning houses, destroying cornfields, killing everyone, men, women, children, and especially children, because the English had learned that Indian children grew up to become Indian warriors. One English soldier described the campaign with a chilling matter-of-factness. "We have killed many. We have burned their houses. We have taken their corn. We have cut down their cornfields. We have done all the mischief we can." Another soldier wrote home boasting that he had personally killed more than 100 people of all ages and sexes. The English also developed a new tactic. They would invite Indian leaders to peace negotiations, then serve them poisoned wine. Or they would promise safe passage, then ambush the delegation. Or they would offer a reward for Powhatan scalps, paying a bounty for every dead Indian head brought to Jamestown. The bounty was higher for a woman than for a man, and higher for a child than for a woman, because children were easier to kill, and the English wanted to encourage genocide. Yes, genocide, that is the word. The English campaign after 1622 was not warfare. It was an attempt to wipe the Powhatan people from the face of the earth. And it nearly succeeded. By 1632, the Powhatan Confederacy had been broken. Their population had collapsed from disease, war, and starvation. Their fields had been burned. Their villages were gone. The survivors fled west into the mountains or south, toward to the Carolina coast. The land that had been theirs for thousands of years now belonged to the English. The peace that followed was not a peace. It was an absence of war. The English had simply run out of people to kill. The legacy of the first colony. So here we are, 400 years later. What do we do with this story? How do we teach it? How do we remember it? The traditional narrative, Jamestown as the gritty birthplace of American democracy, is not just wrong. It is dangerously wrong. It erases the violence. It erases the cannibalism. It erases the genocide. It turns a story of horror and collapse into a feel-good tale of plucky pioneers overcoming adversity. But the truth matters, not because we want to feel guilty about something that happened 4 centuries ago. Guilt is useless. The truth matters because the patterns we see in Jamestown, the arrogance, the cruelty, the failure to learn from mistakes, the willingness to destroy others in the name of survival, did not end in 1622. They are part of the American story. They are part of who we are. Think about what Jamestown actually was. A colony founded by a corporation, driven by profit, indifferent to human life. A place where the powerful terrorized the weak, where the law was a weapon, where the hungry ate the dead. A place where people did things that they could never speak of, and then went home to England and pretended none of it had happened. Does that sound familiar? It should. It is the same pattern that would repeat itself in the slave plantations of the South, the factory towns of the Industrial Revolution, the internment camps of the Second World War. Whenever we convince ourselves that some people are less human than others, whenever we decide that survival justifies any cruelty, we are back in Jamestown. We are back in the fort, smelling the smoke and the rot, watching the starving men eyeing each other in the dark. The survivors of the starving time did not go on to build a better world. They went on to build the same world, just with more tobacco and more slaves. They learned nothing from their suffering except how to inflict it on others. The first Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619, brought in chains on a Dutch ship. Within a generation, the English had built a legal system that enslaved black people for life, passed it down to their children, and justified it with the same kind of savage logic that had justified the destruction of the Powhatan. Jamestown was not the birthplace of American freedom. It was the birthplace of American cruelty. What the bones tell us, you can visit Jamestown today. The site is a National Historic Park. There is a reconstruction of the fort with wattle and daub huts and a wooden church. There is a museum full of artifacts. There are costumed interpreters who will tell you about the daily life of the early colonists. They will tell you about the hardships. They might even mention the starving time. They will not show you the bones. The bones of Jane, the 14-year-old girl who was butchered for stew meat, are kept in a climate-controlled vault. They are studied by scientists. They are not displayed to the public. The curators have decided that the cannibalism is too disturbing, too likely to upset visitors. Better to focus on the positive. Better to tell a story that makes us feel good about our origins. I understand the impulse. I do. No one wants to look at the bones of a child who was eaten. No one wants to think about what that means. But I think we have to. I think we owe it to Jane, and to the hundreds of others who died in that swamp, and to the thousands of Powhatan